From a voice so true, the call reached my ears. Down by the river where the water moves. A gathering of freed families in Arkansas. By 1885, Arkansas held small, determined communities of freed black families, survivors of slavery's nightmare. In the counties near Pine Bluff and Helena, these women and men built wooden cabins with their own hands, planted cotton, corn, and sweet potatoes, and organized schools inside abandoned churches. They held a belief, though the Civil War had ended 2 decades prior, their freedom could at last mean a chance to live with dignity. At sunrise, fathers worked the soil, while mothers tended vegetable gardens and taught children the alphabet using broken slates and chalk. Strong was the community spirit, with Saturday gatherings filled with music, prayer, and hopes for a future no one could seize. Yet freedom in this era was fragile. Often, armed white patrols passed near their land, and whispers of violence traveled from county to county. Tightly the families held to one another, knowing unity was their sole defense. At this moment, the community stood at a crossroads between hope and danger. Unaware that their lives were about to be shattered once more by emerging threats from white landowners. While freed families dreamed of independence, many white landowners in Arkansas were determined to restore the old order. Former Confederates and plantation owners, who once commanded enslaved labor, now faced fields without the free workforce they had relied on for generations. Each season their resentment grew as they watched black farmers buying small plots of land and selling crops in town markets. By 1885, groups of angry whites began holding secret meetings, plotting how to reclaim control. They spread rumors that freed men were lazy or dangerous, poisoning public opinion to justify violence. Sharecropping contracts were already designed to trap black families in endless debt. But for the most ruthless landowners, even that was not enough. They wanted complete domination, the same forced labor that had made their fathers rich before the war. Some organized bands of riders dressed in plain clothes who patrolled the countryside to intimidate and threaten any who resisted. Freed families knew the danger but could not imagine the scale of the coming betrayal. Heavy with tension was the air in Arkansas as 2 visions of the South, freedom and slavery, collided once more upon the same soil. False promises of employment. By the summer of 1885, life for freed black families in Arkansas was already full of hardship. Yet their most valuable possession remained hope. Into this fragile hope stepped men claiming to be recruiters. With confident smiles and trustworthy-sounding words, they rode into communities near Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and small farming towns. They promised steady wages, safe housing, and the chance to work on prosperous farms or railroad projects needing honest labor. To families struggling to sell crops at fair prices or pay off unfair debts, these offers sounded like salvation. The recruiters often carried papers stamped with false signatures, pretending to represent companies from Memphis or St. Louis. They spoke of opportunities that would let parents feed their children and even save money to buy more land. Men and women worn down by poverty believed in the chance for dignity through work. They gathered their few belongings, trusting these promises of a better life. But behind the kind words lay a carefully laid trap. The recruiters were not offering jobs. They were agents for landowners seeking to restore slavery under another name. Willingly the families walked into danger, not knowing their freedom would soon vanish. Ambush and capture. The journey that began with hope quickly turned to terror. As wagons carried men, women, and children toward supposed new farms, the tone shifted. Outside the towns, far from neighbors' eyes, the recruiters revealed their true faces. Armed men appeared on horseback, surrounding the travelers. Rifles were pointed at fathers who dared to question what was happening. From burlap sacks, iron shackles were pulled, and chains clanged as wrists and ankles were locked once more. Screams filled the air as mothers tried to shield their children, but resistance was crushed with whips and the threat of bullets. In the forests of rural Arkansas, the nightmare of bondage returned, hidden from the outside world. Those who had once celebrated post-war freedom now stood helpless, bound and broken. Realizing the trap had been sprung, the captors forced them onto wagons, not as workers, but as property. Every mile driven deeper into isolation was another mile from the dream of independence. Fear settled in their hearts as they understood the law, the papers, and the promises meant nothing. In that moment, freedom in Arkansas became an illusion, and the shadow of slavery reclaimed its victims. Transport to remote plantations. After the capture, the families were forced onto rough wooden wagons. The wheels creaked along muddy Arkansas roads, carrying human lives deeper into isolation. Routes far from towns like Pine Bluff and Little Rock were chosen by the captors, avoiding places where questions might be asked. The journey was long, often taking days, with only short stops at riversides where captives were given dirty water or scraps of cornbread. Mothers tried to comfort their crying children, whispering lullabies even as their own wrists bled from iron chains. In silence fathers sat, their eyes fixed on the horizon, powerless to protect their families. The farther the wagons traveled, the more hopeless the situation became. The land changed from open farmlands to thick forests and swamps, natural barriers that trapped the captives in both body and spirit. The overseers laughed, drinking whiskey as they cracked whips in the air, reminding everyone that resistance meant death. Some tried to memorize landmarks, hoping one day to escape. But the isolation of Arkansas's countryside was designed to erase all paths to freedom. Finally, the wagons stopped at hidden plantations, properties owned by men determined to keep slavery alive despite laws declaring it illegal. Here, away from the reach of newspapers or church networks, the captives were unloaded like animals, their names ignored, their dignity stripped away. For them, the journey ended, but the nightmare had only just begun. Life under forced labor. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Once on the plantations, the daily rhythm of captivity began with the rising sun. At dawn, the sound of a whip against wood or the shouting of overseers dragged men, women, and children into the fields. Endlessly cotton rows stretched across the land, and the work was backbreaking. Under the hot Arkansas sun, hands became raw and blistered from plucking sharp bolls of cotton. Children as young as 10 carried sacks nearly as heavy as their own bodies. Pregnant women were not spared, forced to bend and pull until exhaustion dropped them to the ground. Scarce was the food, usually little more than cornmeal, molasses, or beans served at night after hours of labor. Water breaks were limited, and those who slowed down risked a beating. Overseers carried rifles and whips, reminding the captives with every gesture that their lives held no value beyond the work they could perform. Nights brought no rest. Captives slept in shacks of rotten wood, crowded together on dirt floors. The air filled with the smell of sweat, blood, and despair. Yet, even in these unbearable conditions, signs of resilience appeared. In hushed voices, songs were whispered, prayers spoken, and elders told stories of freedom to keep hope alive. Every sunrise meant another day of suffering, but also another chance to imagine survival. These plantations, hidden deep within Arkansas, became prisons where slavery was reborn, proving that for many, freedom remained a distant dream. Resistance and secret appeals. Even in the darkness of forced bondage, the human spirit searched for ways to resist. Among the captives on those Arkansas plantations were women and men who remembered stories of the Underground Railroad and of churches that had once hidden fugitives. At night, after the overseers drank themselves to sleep, quiet whispers carried from shack to shack. Some spoke of escape, tracing possible routes in the dirt with sticks, memorizing the position of stars and marking trees with hidden symbols. Mothers hushed their children to avoid drawing suspicion, while fathers promised that freedom was still possible. Sometimes messages reached the outside world through traveling black preachers who visited rural communities under the guise of holding prayer meetings. These preachers, carrying worn Bibles and strong voices, listened carefully to the whispered accounts of captivity. When they left, they carried more than sermons. They carried news of hidden slavery to sympathetic churches in towns like Little Rock or Memphis. Letters were written in secret, hidden beneath clothing or disguised in prayer books, appealing for help from those who still fought for justice. But resistance came at a cost. Anyone caught plotting was beaten savagely, sometimes chained to posts as a warning to others. Still, the seed of defiance could not be destroyed. The captives knew that silence meant death of the soul, while resistance kept hope alive. With every whispered plan and every message carried beyond the plantation, the truth of their suffering in Arkansas slowly began moving toward exposure. Exposure of the crime. The truth of illegal bondage in Arkansas did not remain hidden forever. By the late months of 1885, fragments of testimony reached black newspapers in Memphis, Nashville, and Little Rock. Editors who had long warned of slavery by another name finally had concrete accounts of families captured, chained, and forced into fields. Small articles began to circulate, shocking freed communities who thought such horrors belonged only to the past. Vital in spreading the word became church networks. Ministers preached fiery sermons, calling the abuse a betrayal of God's promise and of the nation's laws. In prayer meetings, names of missing men and women were spoken aloud, their absence a painful reminder that freedom was not yet secure. Women's aid societies began gathering clothes and food for escapees who managed to flee. White authorities, however, dismissed the reports as exaggerations. Local sheriffs, often tied by blood or business to the landowners, denied everything. Yet, the noise of truth grew louder. A few brave journalists traveled near the plantations, speaking quietly to those who had escaped and writing stories that described in chilling detail the whips, chains, and endless rows of cotton. These publications spread across the South, stirring outrage among freed people and allies who had fought in the Union Army only 2 decades earlier. More than an article became the exposure of the crime. It became a cry of warning. The world was forced to confront a terrifying fact. Slavery had not truly died in Arkansas. It had only changed shape, hiding in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Confrontation with authorities. As reports of illegal slavery spread, pressure mounted on Arkansas state officials to act. Black communities in Little Rock and Pine Bluff organized petitions demanding investigations. Church leaders carried testimonies from the countryside directly to the governor's office, insisting justice could not be delayed. For many freed families, this was a test of whether the law truly protected them or only served the powerful. When authorities finally sent sheriffs to inspect the plantations, the visits were little more than theater. Local lawmen, often friends or business partners of the landowners, claimed they found no evidence of abuse. They described the captives as workers under contract, hiding the truth behind legal words. Families still in chains were instructed to remain silent with guns aimed at them from behind. Fear silenced many, but a few brave voices tried to speak only to be shouted down. The confrontation reached courtrooms where judges sympathetic to white landowners dismissed testimonies from black witnesses as unreliable. The law, written to appear neutral, was twisted to maintain power. Freed people realized the system itself was designed to protect those who profited from their labor. Still, the persistence of activists, preachers, and journalists kept the issue alive. Even facing lies and cover-ups, the struggle revealed the deep cracks in justice, exposing how fragile freedom remained for black families in Arkansas during 1885. Legacy of fear and memory. Although some captives managed to escape the hidden plantations, many never returned to their communities. Once again families were torn apart, with mothers left to wonder if their sons or husbands still lived somewhere in bondage. Deep ran the memory of betrayal, carried in stories whispered from generation to generation. In Arkansas, freedom came to mean survival rather than true independence. Communities that once gathered with songs and hope now carried caution and silence. Parents taught their children never to trust strangers offering work, warning that behind a friendly voice could hide chains. The scars of 1885 remained, both emotional and physical. Even decades later, elders recalled the sound of wagon wheels rolling into the forest, taking loved ones away forever. Yet these painful memories also built resilience. Stronger centers of protection became churches. Schools taught children about dignity and vigilance, and newspapers continued to expose injustice. The story of the freed community recaptured and forced back into bondage became part of a larger truth, that slavery had not ended cleanly with the Civil War, but had lingered in shadows, taking new forms. This legacy shaped the identity of Black families in Arkansas and beyond. Their suffering was not forgotten. It was transformed into a lesson of survival, courage, and the unbreakable will to fight for real freedom. The echoes of 1885 remind us that liberty, once stolen, must be guarded fiercely. For history has shown how quickly it can be taken away.